I bought my dream lake house with cash. Before I unpacked one box, the police showed up. The HOA president had called 911 on me. She said I looked like I didn't belong there. I stayed calm. I stayed patient. For 6 months, she made my life a war. Then I made one phone call of my own. By morning, she worked for me. My name is Alina Cross, and for 11 years I built a small structured finance firm out of a spare bedroom, buying distressed municipal debt other investors were too nervous to touch. When I finally sold my stake, I promised myself one reward: a quiet house on water, somewhere I could hear loons instead of Slack notifications every morning. I found it in Lake Serenity Estates, a gated community wrapped around a private lake an hour outside the city. The listing photos showed docks, willow trees, and a stillness I hadn't felt in years. I paid cash, signed the papers, and told the movers to be at the house by 9. Lake Serenity Estates was the kind of neighborhood that photographed beautifully and gossiped constantly. Manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes, a welcome sign promising community, pride, belonging. What the listing didn't mention was the woman who had run the HOA board for 9 straight years and treated every rule book like scripture she alone was allowed to interpret. Her name was Deborah Voss, though everyone simply called her Debbie, usually followed by a sigh. Residents joked that Debbie had memorized the HOA bylaws the way other people memorize song lyrics, and that she enforced them with the enthusiasm of someone who had never once been told no in her adult life. I learned all this later, of course, piecemeal, from neighbors speaking in lowered voices over fences. On moving day, I knew none of it. I only knew the moving truck was late. The sun was already climbing, and I had a couch, a dog crate, and a lifetime of boxes to unload alone. The moving crew I'd hired backed their truck up the gravel drive around 10 in the morning. I stood on my new porch in old jeans and a paint-stained t-shirt, directing boxes, sweaty and grinning, feeling for the first time in years like my life belonged entirely to me. I didn't notice the woman watching from the sidewalk across the street. Arms crossed, phone already lifted halfway to her ear. I was too busy admiring how the morning light hit the water behind my new backyard, thinking this was exactly the peace I had worked 11 years to earn. My dog, Biscuit, a scruffy terrier mix, darted off the porch chasing a squirrel toward the neighbor's yard. I jogged after him, calling his name, laughing despite myself. That laugh, that ordinary, harmless laugh, was apparently the final piece of evidence the woman across the street needed. Debbie Voss had lived at 14 Marina Court for 12 years and had appointed herself the unofficial sentry of Lake Serenity Estates long before she ever won an HOA election. Neighbors said she kept binoculars on her windowsill, not for bird watching, but for watching license plates pull into driveways that weren't hers. She had built her reputation on catching things. A trash can left out an hour too long, a holiday wreath hung a day past the bylaw deadline, a lawn mowed at what she considered an unapproved angle. Residents paid their fines quietly, because arguing with Debbie cost more time than it saved. What Debbie hadn't been told, because the sale had closed quickly through a private buyer's agent, was that the little blue house on Marina Court had sold at all. As far as she knew, the Hendersons who'd owned it were still traveling, and anyone unloading boxes there had no right to be. She didn't ask. She didn't check the community portal where closings were sometimes, eventually, logged. She simply watched a stranger in paint-stained clothes hauling furniture into a house she considered practically her own responsibility to protect, and she decided this was a crime in progress. 911. "What's your emergency?" the dispatcher answered. Debbie's voice, I'd learn later from the police report, was calm, almost pleasant. "I'd like to report a break-in at 14 Marina Court. I'm sorry. 12 Marina Court. There's someone moving things into a house that isn't hers." "I don't recognize her at all." She told the dispatcher I looked out of place, that the real owners were a very nice older couple, and that I was acting like I owned it. She didn't mention that she'd never once spoken to the Hendersons about selling. She simply assumed. An assumption, for Debbie, had always been enough. I was carrying a lamp up my own front steps when the first cruiser turned onto Marina Court. Lights off but moving with purpose. I remember thinking it must be for someone else. Nothing in 11 years of paperwork, contracts, and closings had prepared me for what came next. The officer stepped out slowly, one hand resting near his belt, the other raised in the universal gesture for "stay where you are." "Ma'am," he said, "can you step away from the house and tell me what you're doing here?" Biscuit barked once, sensing something in my body had gone rigid. "I'm sorry, I live here," I said, setting the lamp down carefully. "I closed on this house 2 weeks ago." My voice came out steadier than I felt. I'd negotiated 8-figure debt deals without flinching, yet standing in my own driveway explaining my existence made my hands shake. The officer, whose nameplate read M. Delgado, glanced toward the sidewalk, where Debbie now stood in a cardigan despite the July heat, phone still in hand, watching the scene with the satisfied posture of someone who believed she had just prevented a disaster. "Ma'am, someone called in a possible break-in," Delgado said, not unkindly. "Said the owners were an older couple, out of town. Said you didn't look like you belonged." He paused. "Do you have anything showing this is your address?" "Date. Mail. ID with this house on it." I hadn't kicked in yet. My license still listed my old apartment. I had boxes labeled kitchen and bathroom stacked on the lawn, a moving crew standing awkwardly by the truck, and absolutely no paperwork on me proving the one thing that should have been obvious. This was my house. "I can pull up the closing documents on my phone," I offered, already scrolling. Delgado nodded, patient, professional, clearly used to defusing situations that shouldn't have needed defusing in the first place. Across the street, Debbie hadn't moved. If anything, she looked disappointed that this might resolve peacefully. While I searched my email for the PDF, Debbie called out from the sidewalk, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "I've lived here 12 years. Officer, I know every family on this block. I've never seen her before in my life. You can't be too careful these days." Delgado's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice stayed level. "Ma'am, I appreciate the concern, but I need you to stay back while I verify." Debbie didn't stay back. She drifted closer, close enough to peer at my phone screen as I finally pulled up the recorded deed. My name printed clearly at the top. "Alina Cross," Delgado read aloud, comparing it to something on his own device. He exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders. "Okay. County records show the sale closed 2 weeks ago." He looked at Debbie. She owns the property. Ma'am, this isn't a break-in. Debbie's face did something complicated. A flicker of embarrassment quickly replaced by defensive irritation. Well, how was I supposed to know that? Nobody tells me anything anymore. I'm the HOA president. People are supposed to notify the board before closings. For security reasons. Delgado said nothing, which somehow said everything. I'm sorry for the trouble. Ma'am, Delgado told me, tipping his hat slightly. Welcome to the neighborhood. I guess. He walked back to his cruiser without another word to Debbie. Though the set of his shoulders suggested this wasn't the first false alarm she generated on Marina Court. Debbie lingered even after the cruiser pulled away, watching me the way a cat watches something it hasn't decided whether to trust. You should really introduce yourself to the board, she finally said. There are procedures. We like to know who's living among us. I'm Alina, I said, extending a hand she didn't take. I'll be sure to introduce myself properly once I'm unpacked. She studied me another moment, eyes flicking to my paint-stained shirt, the rental truck, the modest sedan in my driveway, as if calculating whether I truly belonged in her $900,000 cul-de-sac. There's a welcome packet, she said finally, already turning to leave. I'll have someone drop it off, along with the architectural guidelines and the landscaping requirements. You'll want to read them carefully. Her tone made clear this wasn't hospitality. It was a warning dressed up as paperwork. I watched her walk back to her house at the end of the cul-de-sac, the biggest one on the street, with its immaculate topiary and a small brass sign by the door that read the Voss residence, as if the title needed announcing. I told myself it was a one-time misunderstanding. That night, exhausted, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, I sat on my new back porch and watched the sun set over the lake, telling myself the police call was an isolated incident, an overzealous neighbor with too much time and too little to occupy it. I had no idea how wrong I was. The welcome packet arrived the next morning. Not dropped off but taped forcefully to my front door. 17 pages long. Printed on Debbie's personal letterhead, rather than any official HOA template. Buried in page 11 was a handwritten note. Please schedule your board introduction within 5 business days. D. President. I read through the packet with the same care I'd once given billion-dollar bond covenants, noting rules about mailbox paint colors, approved shades of exterior trim, mandatory holiday decoration removal dates, and a clause requiring prior written approval for any pet weighing over 25 pounds. Biscuit, a 19, apparently squeaked by. I decided to take the high road. I emailed Debbie directly, polite and brief, apologizing again for any confusion the day before, and offering to meet whenever convenient to go over community expectations. Her reply came within minutes. Board meets Thursdays at 7 p.m. Attendance is not optional for new owners. D. I showed up Thursday at 7 sharp, notebook in hand, genuinely hoping to start fresh. I had no way of knowing that Debbie had already decided, somewhere in the space between that 911 call and this meeting, that I was a problem she intended to solve on her own terms. The HOA meeting was held in the clubhouse by the lake, a small building with folding chairs and a folding table where Debbie sat flanked by 2 board members who mostly nodded along to whatever she said. I was the only new business on the agenda, which felt ominous before I'd even sat down. "Everyone, this is Alina Cross," Debbie announced, gesturing toward me like a teacher introducing a disruptive transfer student. "She's just moved into 14 Marina Court. I'm sure we'll all help her understand how things work around here." A few neighbors offered polite smiles. One woman near the back did not smile at all. That woman was Josephine Okafor, 73, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived on Marina Court longer than anyone else in the room, including Debbie. After the meeting, she caught up with me in the parking lot, glancing back at the clubhouse before speaking. "Watch yourself with her, honey. She collects people like you for sport." "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely startled by the bluntness.
Josephine sighed.
The kind of sigh that carried years behind it. "She ran the Pattersons out 2 summers ago over a fence. Fined the Ibrahim family into bankruptcy over a basketball hoop. She likes new people best. Fresh targets." I laughed it off at first, chalking it up to neighborhood drama, the kind every community seemed to have somewhere. I thanked Josephine for the warning, told her I appreciated it, and drove home telling myself I'd simply be careful, follow the rules, and avoid giving Debbie anything to complain about. For the first 2 weeks, that strategy worked. I painted my mailbox the approved shade of navy, kept my lawn trimmed to regulation height, and even submitted a formal request before hanging a wind chime on my porch, which Debbie's committee approved with visible reluctance 3 days later. I started to relax. Exchanged banana bread with the family 2 doors down. Let Biscuit run laps around the backyard while I worked remotely from the porch. Laptop balanced on my knees. Lake glittering in the distance. For the first time in years, mornings felt easy. The ease didn't last. I found a violation notice tucked under my windshield wiper instead of mailed, which I'd later learn was Debbie's preferred method, since it guaranteed she got to watch people discover their fines in real time from behind her curtains. The notice cited me for unauthorized vehicle storage, referring to my sedan, which I had, according to the letter, parked at an angle inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. I stood in my driveway reading it twice, certain it was a joke. It was not. Due within 10 days. I paid it. Felt like an absurd hill to argue over, and I still believed, foolishly, that compliance would eventually earn me peace. What I didn't yet understand was that with Debbie, compliance wasn't a resolution. It was simply proof that the system worked, and that she could push further. The following week brought a citation for my garden hose, coiled neatly by the side of the house but apparently visible from the street in violation of Section 4.2 screening requirement. Then came a note about Biscuits barking, timestamped at 6:47 a.m., logged with a precision that suggested Debbie had been standing outside my fence with a stopwatch. I began keeping my own file, an old finance habit dying hard, screenshotting every notice, timestamping every interaction, saving every email. Something about the pattern felt less like enforcement and more like surveillance, and years of reading contracts had taught me that patterns eventually became evidence, whether anyone intended them to or not. I mentioned the citations to Josephine one afternoon over her fence, half joking about becoming the neighborhood's most fined resident in under a month. Josephine's face didn't hold the humor I expected. That's exactly how it started with the Ibrahims, she said quietly. Small things. Then things that weren't even true. What do you mean? Weren't true? I asked. Josephine glanced toward Debbie's house before answering. She once claimed Mr. Ibrahim threatened her at a board meeting. There were 11 witnesses who said it never happened. The board fined him anyway. He moved before it went further. Nobody ever apologized. I didn't want to believe a $50 mailbox fine and a HOA citation belonged in the same category as fabricated threats and forced relocations. But a small, uneasy feeling started forming in my chest. The same feeling I used to get reviewing a bond prospectus that looked clean on paper but wrong underneath. 2 days later, Debbie herself appeared at my door, clipboard in hand, unannounced. I wanted to personally walk your property for the quarterly inspection, she said, already stepping past me into the yard before I'd fully opened the door.
New owners tend to need extra.
She circled my house slowly, jotting notes I couldn't see, pausing at my flower beds, my gutters, the small vegetable garden I'd planted along the side fence. Tomatoes aren't on the approved plant list, she said, tapping her pen against the clipboard.
You'll need to remove those.
There's an approved plant list for a garden I can't see from the street? I asked, keeping my tone light, testing whether reason would land anywhere with her. Debbie's smile thinned. Subsection 3. It's all in the packet you were given. I'd hoped you'd have read it more thoroughly by now. I bit back a dozen responses and simply nodded, walking her back toward the front gate, done pretending this was a neighborly visit. As she left, she paused at the end of my walkway and said, almost casually, you know, the Hendersons kept a much tidier property. I do hope you'll live up to it. That comment stayed with me longer than any fine. It wasn't about tomatoes or mailboxes. It was a message, delivered with a smile. You don't measure up yet, and I get to decide when, or if, you ever will. I stood in my driveway a long time after she left. Jaw tight, I called my closing attorney that evening, half out of frustration, half out of genuine curiosity about my rights. She laughed softly when I described the tomato citation. HOAs have real power, unfortunately, especially over liens, she said, but they also have to follow their own bylaws. Document everything. That's your leverage. Document everything. It's 100 times in my old career. And somehow it had taken a tomato plant to remind me to apply it to my own life. I started a spreadsheet that night. The same instinct that once tracked bond covenants now tracking Debbie Voss's escalating pattern of citations. Over the following weeks, the notices kept coming, each one slightly more absurd than the last. A wreath hung 2 days past the seasonal deadline. A recycling bin left visible an extra hour. A suspicious delivery van parked in my driveway for a wine subscription Debbie apparently found personally offensive. I paid some fines, contested others in writing, and watched my folder of documentation grow thicker with every passing week. Neighbors began stopping by quietly, almost furtively, to share their own stories, as if my spreadsheet had become an unofficial support group for anyone who'd survived a season under Debbie's rule. She did this to us over a bird bath, said the young couple at 18 Marina Court, showing me a photo of a fine notice that cited excessive avian attraction, disruptive to neighborhood tranquility. I laughed until I realized they weren't joking, and that they'd actually paid the $75 fine rather than fight it. What struck me most wasn't the pettiness of any single complaint. It was the pattern underneath it, the way every citation seemed to target people who were new, quiet, or simply unlikely to push back, while longtime board allies somehow never received so much as a warning for identical infractions. I began quietly cross-referencing addresses. The board treasurer's overgrown hedge, technically 2 feet past the allowed height, went unsighted for months. My neighbor's identical hedge earned a notice within a week of moving in. The pattern wasn't paranoia. It was math, and I had spent a career reading exactly this kind of math. Still, I told myself to keep my head down through the fall. I had nothing to gain from open warfare with a woman who clearly enjoyed conflict more than most people enjoyed peace, and everything to gain from simply living quietly in the home I'd worked so hard to earn. That plan lasted until October, when Debbie called an emergency board meeting specifically, according to the agenda emailed to residents, to discuss ongoing concerns regarding Marina Court property compliance, with my address listed as the sole item under new business, as though I had somehow become a civic emergency. I sat through that meeting watching Debbie present a slideshow, an actual slideshow, of photographs taken from public sidewalks and, in at least 2 images, clearly from someone standing on my own side lawn. Tomatoes. Biscuit mid-bark, captured with what looked like a zoom lens. I want to be clear, this isn't personal, Debbie told the room, though her eyes stayed fixed on me the entire time. It's about protecting the values, and the property values, of everyone on this street. One owner's carelessness affects us all. Several board members nodded along, none meeting my eyes directly. When I was finally given a chance to respond, I kept my voice level, the same voice I'd once used in front of investment committees deciding whether to trust me with 9 figures. I've paid every fine issued to me. I've complied with every notice. I'd like to understand what more compliance looks like. Debbie didn't have an answer ready for that, which seemed to genuinely surprise her. "We'll circle back," she said, moving briskly to the next slide, though there was no next item on the actual agenda. The meeting ended in an uncomfortable silence that followed me all the way to my car. Josephine caught me in the parking lot again, her expression grim. "She's never done a slideshow before," she said. "That's new." "Serious about you." I asked. "Serious about what exactly?" Josephine hesitated. "About making you leave." Sometimes those end up being the same thing. I didn't sleep well that night. Replaying the slideshow, the zoomed photo of my own backyard, the casual violation of privacy dressed up as civic duty. I thought about calling my old colleagues, people who understood how to fight institutional overreach with paperwork instead of panic, and decided the time had come. The next morning I emailed the HOA's management company, a small firm technically overseeing the board's compliance with state regulations, requesting copies of every bylaw amendment passed in the last 5 years, along with meeting minutes and fine schedules. It felt like the opening move in a game I hadn't chosen to play. The management company's response was slow, apologetic, and revealing in its own way. Several of the rules Debbie had cited me for, including the tomato plant restriction, didn't appear anywhere in the actual recorded bylaws. They existed only in Debbie's personal welcome packet, the one she'd printed on her own letterhead. I sat with that information for a full day before deciding how to use it. Confronting Debbie directly felt satisfying but pointless. She'd simply claim the rules were informal guidance and move the goalposts again. I needed something sturdier than an argument. I needed proof strong enough that even her allies couldn't ignore. I began attending every board meeting after that, notebook in hand, asking pointed but polite questions about which rules were officially recorded versus informally enforced. Debbie's answers grew shorter, sharper, visibly irritated by a resident who had apparently stopped playing the role of quiet, apologetic newcomer she'd assigned me. "You're welcome to review the bylaws whenever you'd like," she snapped at one meeting, after I asked for the third time where the tomato restriction was codified.
"Though I think your time would be better spent maintaining your property."
I let the comment sit in the room without responding, the way I'd learned to let a bad faith argument collapse under its own silence in negotiations. Several neighbors exchanged glances. For the first time, I sensed the room's sympathy shifting, just slightly, away from Debbie and toward the woman she'd chosen to make an example of. For a few weeks after that meeting, things went quiet. No new citations arrived. No slideshow appeared on any agenda. I almost let myself believe Debbie had backed off, that documenting her overreach had been enough to make her reconsider whether I was worth the trouble. I should have known better. I spent those quiet weeks settling further into the house, finally hanging photos, finishing the garden, even hosting Josephine and a few other neighbors for coffee on my back porch, listening to their own quiet grievances about years spent tiptoeing around a woman none of them had the standing, individually, to challenge. "She's been HOA president unopposed for 9 years, Josephine explained, stirring her coffee. "Nobody runs against her because nobody wants their life turned into hers afterward. She has a way of making you regret ever crossing her, even years later." I filed that comment away with everything else I'd been collecting. I started researching the HOA's actual legal structure during that lull, partly out of curiosity, partly out of the old professional instinct that never quite left me. Lake Serenity Estates, I learned, wasn't just a homeowners association. It sat on land with a separate, privately held easement covering the roads and lake access. The private road easement, according to county records, had been established decades earlier by the original developer and never fully transferred to the HOA itself. It remained held by a small holding company, dormant for years, its ownership tangled in an old estate that had never been properly settled or sold. I found this fascinating in the way I used to find distressed municipal debt fascinating. A forgotten asset, technically valuable, sitting unclaimed because nobody had bothered to untangle it. I didn't think much more about it at the time. I simply filed the information away, the way I filed everything else. The quiet ended on a Sunday morning when I woke to find Biscuit's dog run. A small fenced area I'd installed along the side yard, spray painted with a crude red X and a note zip-tied to the fence reading, "Unapproved structure. Remove immediately." No official notice. Just vandalism dressed as enforcement. I photographed everything before touching it, then called the non-emergency police line to file a report. Since spray paint on private property, HOA rules or not, was still vandalism. Officer Delgado, the same officer from my first day, arrived to take the report, recognizing me immediately. "You again," he said, Not unkindly. Any idea who might have done this? He asked, though his tone suggested he already had a guess. I told him about the ongoing citations, the slideshow, the tomato plant, the zoomed photograph of my own backyard. He nodded slowly, writing it all down. We've had calls about her before. Never enough to act on. What would be enough? I asked. Delgado hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Pattern. Something that shows intent, not just annoyance. I almost laughed. I had 11 weeks of screenshots, timestamps, and fine notices sitting in a spreadsheet more organized than half the loan files I used to underwrite professionally. I think I might already have that, I told him. He raised an eyebrow, handed me his card, and told me to reach out if the pattern continued or worsened. I thanked him, watched him drive away, and stood in my yard staring at the red spray-painted X, feeling something shift inside me. I wasn't angry in the loud, reactive way anymore. I was angry in the quiet, methodical way I used to get before a hostile takeover negotiation. The kind of anger that didn't shout, didn't threaten, but simply started building a case, patiently, brick by brick, until there was nowhere left to hide. I called Josephine that evening and asked her directly whether she'd be willing to testify, formally, about the pattern she'd described to me over coffee. She went quiet for a long moment. I've wanted someone to ask me that for years, she finally said. Nobody ever stayed long enough to ask. Over the following days, 3 more neighbors quietly agreed to share their own documentation. The Ibrahim's old fine records, forwarded by a cousin who'd kept copies.
The young couple's birdbath citation. A retired veteran 2 streets over who'd been fined.
A pattern was forming, clear enough now that even I, someone who'd spent a career finding patterns in messy data, felt slightly stunned by how consistent it was. Debbie didn't enforce rules. She enforced power, targeting whoever seemed least likely to fight back, and escalating whenever someone dared to try. I didn't confront her yet. Kept documenting, kept attending meetings with the same calm, unreadable expression I used to wear across boardroom tables from men who assumed a quiet woman with a notebook was no threat at all. Debbie, I suspected, was making the exact same mistake. The next escalation came disguised as generosity. Debbie announced at a board meeting that the HOA would be offering financial counseling to residents struggling with fine compliance, a program she would personally oversee, which conveniently gave her direct access to residents' financial information under the guise of helping them. I watched 3 older residents, including Josephine, sign up out of genuine anxiety about mounting fines, handing over bank statements and income details to a woman who had already demonstrated she couldn't be trusted with something as small as a tomato plant, let alone something as sensitive as their finances. I refused the counseling myself, citing privacy concerns, which earned me a pointed comment at the next meeting about residents who don't want help, being the ones who usually need it most. The room laughed, uncomfortably, the kind of laugh that came from people afraid of becoming her next target. Weeks later, Josephine came to me pale and shaking, clutching a letter from the HOA's finance committee, chaired, unsurprisingly, by Debbie's husband, Roy Voss, the HOA treasurer. The letter claimed Josephine owed nearly $4,000 in accumulated fines and processing fees, dating back 3 years, threatening a lien on her home. "I've never received a single fine notice in 3 years," Josephine told me, hands trembling around the letter. "Not one. $4,000. I took the letter, scanned it, and felt that old, familiar cold clarity settle over me. The same feeling I got reading a fraudulent prospectus. I asked Josephine to gather every piece of HOA correspondence she'd received over the past 3 years, and compared it line by line against the fines listed in the new letter. 11 of the 14 cited violations had no corresponding notice ever sent to her. Not by mail. Not by email. Not at all. "They're fabricating a paper trail," I told her, spreading the documents across my kitchen table. "This isn't a mistake. Someone built this deliberately, probably assuming you wouldn't fight it." Josephine, 73 years old, retired on a fixed income, stared at the letter with an expression somewhere between fear and fury. I offered to help her draft a formal dispute, citing the HOA's own bylaws requiring timely written notice for any fine to be valid. We submitted it together, certified mail, return receipt requested, a habit I'd never fully shaken from my old career, where paper trails were the only thing that mattered in a fight. Debbie's response arrived not as a letter but as a phone call to Josephine directly, warm and concerned on the surface, subtly threatening underneath. "I'd hate for this to become a bigger issue than it needs to be," she reportedly said. "Liens can affect your ability to sell, you know, down the road." Josephine relayed the call to me word for word, her voice tight with the particular fear of someone who had lived through a lifetime of being told, gently and repeatedly, to be grateful for whatever scraps of respect the powerful chose to offer her. "She's threatening my house," Josephine said. I called my attorney again, this time formally retaining her, not just for advice but for representation, both for myself and, with Josephine's blessing, for her as well. "This isn't HOA overreach anymore," my attorney said after reviewing the documents.
"Fabricated fine notices used to
We filed a formal complaint with the state's HOA regulatory board, attaching every document, the fabricated fine history, the missing notices, the pattern of selective enforcement across a dozen households. It felt like the first real move in a chess game I'd been forced into without ever agreeing to play. The state complaint took weeks to process, bureaucratic and slow in the way official processes always were, but it created something valuable, an official record, time-stamped, independent of Debbie's control, that couldn't simply be erased or reframed the way she'd erased and reframed every informal complaint before mine. While we waited, Debbie's tactics shifted again, growing bolder in ways that suggested she either hadn't heard about the complaint yet or simply didn't believe it could touch her. She began appearing at my house unannounced more frequently, always with a new, minor infraction freshly discovered on her latest inspection. One afternoon I found her standing at my fence line with a tape measure, muttering to herself about setback violations on a shed I'd built with a permitted contractor, inspected and approved by the county months earlier. When I pointed out the county approval, she simply said, "The county isn't the HOA." "No," I agreed evenly, "but the HOA isn't the county either. And the county's approval is legally binding regardless of what your committee decides. Debbie's face tightened. That familiar flicker of someone unused to being contradicted with actual facts instead of nervous compliance. She left without another word that day. I began noticing something else during these encounters. Debbie rarely brought up Roy, her husband, despite his role as treasurer, despite the fact that his signature appeared on nearly every fabricated fine notice sent to Josephine and, I later confirmed, to at least 4 other households across the neighborhood. I requested the HOA's financial records through the same regulatory complaint process, citing residents' legal right to review association finances. The management company, increasingly uneasy about the growing paper trail, complied faster than I expected, forwarding 3 years of ledgers, bank statements, and expense reports directly to my attorney. What we found in those ledgers took even my finance-trained eyes a moment to fully absorb. Thousands of dollars in administrative fees routed to a
company called RV Consulting Group, an entity whose registered agent, according to a quick state record search, was Roy Voss himself, Debbie's husband.
RV Consulting Group had, over 3 years, invoiced the HOA nearly $90,000 for vague services, compliance review, community outreach, administrative processing, none of which corresponded to any actual vendor work performed, verified, or approved by a full board vote, according to the meeting minutes we'd also obtained. I sat with my attorney reviewing the ledgers late one evening. The same quiet, focused energy I used to bring to due diligence meetings settling over the room. "This isn't sloppy bookkeeping," she said finally. "This is embezzlement, dressed up just carefully enough to survive a casual glance. But not a real audit." We didn't move immediately. My attorney was clear. Filing prematurely, without airtight documentation, risked giving Debbie time to destroy records, shift blame, or simply resign quietly and disappear into some other unsuspecting neighborhood to repeat the same pattern elsewhere. We needed to be patient, thorough, and, above all, quiet. While we built the case privately, life on Marina Court continued its uneasy rhythm. Debbie, apparently unaware of how much ground had shifted beneath her, doubled down on visible enforcement, perhaps sensing on some instinctive level that her control was slipping and reaching, as people like her always did, for more control instead of less. She sent a mass email to the entire neighborhood. Subject line, Community Standards Reminder, specifically naming 3 households, mine included, as examples of ongoing non-compliance threatening our shared property values. It was, my attorney noted with something close to satisfaction, a wonderfully public and permanent piece of evidence. Neighbors who'd once quietly complied started reaching out to me directly after that email. Emboldened, seemed, by watching someone finally push back instead of simply paying whatever fine appeared under their windshield wiper. My kitchen table began filling with more documents, more stories, more pieces of the same ugly pattern. The young couple from 18 Marina Court, the ones fined over the birdbath, brought over a folder of their own, 2 separate incidents where Debbie had shown up on their property without notice, once while the wife was home alone, letting herself partway into the garage to inspect for code violations. That detail alarmed my attorney more than the financial fraud had. "That's not just overreach," she said. Depending on what the bylaws actually authorize versus what she's claiming they authorize, that could be trespassing. Multiple counts, if this pattern holds across enough households. The case, quietly, was becoming bigger than fines. I began keeping a master timeline, cross-referencing dates, addresses, and incidents, the same visual mapping technique I used to use tracking complex debt restructurings. On paper, spread across my dining table, it looked less like a neighborhood dispute and more like the anatomy of a small, self-contained abuse of power. Roy Voss, for his part, remained almost invisible throughout all of this, a quiet presence at board meetings who rarely spoke, deferring always to Debbie, signing whatever she placed in front of him. I began to wonder whether he was a willing partner in the fraud or simply another person too afraid to object. I got a partial answer one evening when Roy approached me alone at the mailbox cluster, glancing nervously toward his own house before speaking. "You should be careful," he said quietly. "She doesn't let things go. Ever." I asked him directly whether he knew about the RV consulting invoices. His silence was answer enough. "I just handle what she tells me to handle," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "It's easier that way." He walked away before I could ask anything further. But the exchange confirmed something important. Roy wasn't a mastermind. He was a tool, one increasingly uneasy about the machine he was part of. My attorney flagged that conversation as potentially useful later, evidence that even Roy sensed the arrangement wouldn't survive scrutiny. "People who feel guilty," she said, "eventually become witnesses, if you give them a safe enough door to walk through." I didn't know yet how soon we'd need that door. Debbie, meanwhile, seemed to sense something shifting in the neighborhood's mood, though she misread the cause entirely. Rather than suspecting an investigation, she assumed simple insubordination, and responded the way she always had, by escalating harder, louder, more publicly, determined to remind Marina Court exactly who held the power here. She called another emergency meeting, this time proposing a new bylaw amendment requiring all residents to submit quarterly compliance photographs of their property directly to the board for review, a proposal so invasive that even her usually silent allies on the board hesitated visibly before voting. I stood up during the public comment period, calm, deliberate, and asked a single question. Under what authority does the board plan to store and review private photographs of residents' homes? And who specifically will have access to them? Debbie's answer was vague, defensive, and, notably, avoided mentioning Roy by name. The proposal failed by a narrow vote. The first real defeat Debbie had suffered in 9 years of unchallenged leadership. She didn't take it gracefully. As the meeting adjourned, she caught my eye across the room with an expression I can only describe as a promise. "This isn't over." That promise arrived 3 days later in the form of a certified letter, notifying me that the HOA board was initiating a formal compliance review of my property, citing the tomato plants, the shed, the dog run, and, absurdly, the wind chime that had been officially approved months earlier. The letter demanded a mandatory in-person hearing before the full board, warning that failure to attend, or failure to achieve satisfactory compliance, could result in fines escalating to lien proceedings against the property. It was, my attorney confirmed after reading it twice, an almost textbook act of retaliation. "This is good," my attorney said, somewhat to my surprise. Retaliatory enforcement after you filed a state complaint. Timed this closely. Strengthens our case significantly. She's not just careless anymore. She's demonstrably vindictive. And vindictive people leave trails. I didn't feel reassured so much as steeled for what was coming. I attended the hearing exactly as instructed. On time. Prepared. My attorney seated beside me for the first time in any HOA proceeding. A fact that visibly unsettled Debbie the moment we walked in together. I wasn't aware legal counsel was necessary for a simple compliance review, she said tightly. Given the circumstances, my attorney replied evenly, I think it's a reasonable precaution. Debbie's allies on the board shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing, perhaps for the first time, that this particular new resident wasn't going to fold the way so many others quietly had before her. The hearing itself was almost theatrical in its pettiness. Photographs of my tomato plants projected onto a screen. Measurements of my shed's setback read aloud with exaggerated gravity. My dog run described as a structural hazard despite having passed county inspection months earlier without complaint from anyone but Debbie. My attorney methodically dismantled each citation, producing county permits, prior board approvals, and photographic timestamps proving several violations had existed, unremarked upon, for months before suddenly becoming urgent the moment I filed a state complaint. The board's silence grew heavier with each point she made. I'd also like to formally note, my attorney added toward the end, that we've filed a request with the state regulatory board regarding several fine notices sent to other residents that don't correspond to any documented violation, and financial records showing payments to a company registered to the HOA treasurer. The room went completely silent. Debbie's face, usually composed into practiced authority, flickered with something close to panic before she caught herself. I'm not sure what you're implying, she said, voice tighter than before. But I'd advise against making accusations you can't substantiate. My attorney simply opened her folder wider. We can substantiate quite a bit, she said calmly, sliding copies of the RV consulting invoices across the table toward the board. Not toward Debbie specifically, but toward the two other board members who, until this moment, had rubber-stamped everything without question. Their faces changed the moment they read the numbers. One board member, a soft-spoken retired accountant named Harold Kim, picked up the invoice pages with visibly shaking hands. Deborah, he said slowly, these payments went to your husband's company? $90,000. Over 3 years. With no itemized services. Debbie's composure cracked. Just slightly. Just enough to be noticed by everyone in the room. Roy has provided valuable consulting services to this community for years, she snapped, though her voice had lost the commanding certainty it usually carried. I don't appreciate the insinuation that there's anything improper happening here. This meeting is about her tomato plants, not about baseless financial accusations. I think, Harold said quietly, setting the invoices down, we should table the compliance review and schedule a full financial audit instead. Several other board members murmured agreement, the room's energy shifting visibly away from Debbie for what felt like the first time in the community's 9-year history under her rule. Debbie left the meeting early, citing a prior commitment, though everyone present understood she was retreating, not departing gracefully. My attorney and I walked to our cars in the parking lot afterward. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to hope instead of dread. "She's cornered," my attorney said. And cornered people do one of two things. They surrender, or they lash out. Given everything you've told me about her, I'd prepare for the second option. I nodded, thinking of the spray-painted X on Biscuit's fence, the slideshow, the tomato plants photographed with a zoom lens. I didn't have to wait long to find out which path Debbie would choose. Within 48 hours, the lashing out began, faster and angrier than even my attorney's warning had prepared me for, confirming that 9 years of unchecked power had left Debbie Voss with absolutely no instinct for graceful defeat. Started with my mail. All delivered according to tracking, simply vanished from my porch, while neighbors reported seeing Debbie's car idling near the mailbox cluster at odd hours. I couldn't prove it was her. Not yet, but the timing felt far too precise to be coincidence. Then came the anonymous complaint filed with my employer's compliance department, an old firm I still consulted for occasionally, alleging vague ethical concerns about my conduct that, upon investigation, traced back to an email account created just days earlier using a variation of Debbie's maiden name. My old firm dismissed the complaint within a day, recognizing it immediately as baseless. But the message was clear. Debbie was no longer content fighting through HOA channels alone. She was reaching outward, trying to damage anything connected to me, however indirectly, however unlikely to actually land. Josephine's mailbox was vandalized next. The same crude spray paint style as my dog run. This time accompanied by a note reading, "Some people should mind their own business." Josephine, shaken but resolute, called the police herself this time, refusing to let fear silence her the way it once had for years. Officer Delgado responded again, and this time, standing in Josephine's driveway comparing spray paint patterns to the photos from my own property months earlier, his expression shifted from patient professionalism into something sharper, more focused. "This is a pattern now," he said.
"I'm going to recommend we..."
The formal police file, combined with the state regulatory complaint and the emerging financial fraud evidence, created something my attorney called convergence, multiple independent threads of misconduct beginning to braid together into a single, undeniable picture. Debbie, sensing the walls closing in, made her most reckless move yet. She called an emergency, closed-door board session, technically illegal under the HOA's own bylaws requiring advance public notice for any meeting involving financial matters.
Harold Kim.
Increasingly uneasy about everything he'd learned, texted me the meeting's existence within the hour, a small but pivotal act of quiet defection. My attorney immediately filed a formal objection with the state regulatory board, citing the illegal meeting as further evidence of governance failure, while simultaneously requesting an emergency injunction preventing the HOA from placing any lien on my property or Josephine's while the fraud investigation remained active and unresolved. The injunction was granted within days, a small but significant legal victory that stripped Debbie of one of her most powerful remaining weapons, the threat of foreclosure through fines. Without that leverage, her control over the neighborhood's sphere began visibly eroding, household by household, conversation by conversation. Neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid Debbie's attention started approaching her directly, asking pointed questions about the RV consulting payments. Questions she deflected with increasingly thin explanations that satisfied no one. Least of all the people who'd spent years quietly paying fines to fund whatever scheme this actually was. I began receiving calls from residents I'd never even met. People from other streets within the larger Lake Serenity development, asking whether the rumors were true, whether there was really an investigation, whether they too might have grounds to challenge fines they'd paid quietly for years out of simple exhaustion. My kitchen table, once cluttered with moving boxes, now functioned as something closer to an informal command center, stacked with folders, timelines, and copies of financial records, while my attorney and I worked late into several evenings preparing what was quickly becoming a far larger case than either of us initially expected. Debbie, for her part, retreated into a strange, brittle silence, no longer sending mass emails, no longer appearing unannounced at anyone's property, though neighbors reported still seeing her curtains twitch at odd hours, still watching, still calculating, like a general regrouping rather than surrendering after a lost battle. That silence broke violently one evening when Debbie appeared at my front door without warning. No clipboard this time. No pretense of official business. Just raw, unfiltered anger barely contained behind a tight, controlled voice. "You think you can just walk in here and destroy everything I've built," she said. "I haven't destroyed anything," I answered evenly, standing my ground on my own porch. "I've documented what already existed. That's a very different thing." Debbie's composure cracked further, her voice rising despite herself. 9 years. This community safe, organized, valuable, and you show up and tear it apart. Safe for who? Debbie? I asked, genuinely curious despite everything. Not for Josephine. Not for the Ibrahims. Not for anyone who couldn't afford to fight back. She had no answer for that. Just a long, furious silence before turning and walking back toward her house. Shoulders rigid, pace almost violent. I called my attorney immediately afterward to report the confrontation. And Officer Delgado, once informed, added it as another documented incident in the growing file. "She's escalating outside any official channel now," my attorney said. "That's usually the point where people like this make their biggest, most exposing mistake." The biggest mistake came 2 weeks later, and it involved Roy. Quiet, nervous Roy, who'd been slowly unraveling under the weight of a scheme he'd apparently never fully wanted any part of, finally reached out to my attorney directly, requesting a private meeting he insisted Debbie couldn't know about. Roy arrived at my attorney's office pale, visibly shaking, carrying a thumb drive he said contained the real financial records, the ones Debbie kept separate from what she showed the board. Spreadsheets tracking exactly how much of the RV consulting money had actually gone toward personal expenses rather than any HOA service. "She told me it was fine," Roy said quietly, according to my attorney's later account. "She said the board never really checks anything, that everyone's too scared of her to ask real questions. I just wanted it to stop. I didn't know how to make it stop without this." The thumb drive, once reviewed, revealed a scheme even more extensive than we'd initially suspected. Nearly $140,000 diverted over 5 years, not 3, funneled through RV consulting into a private account used for vacations, a boat, and a down payment on a lake cabin 2 counties over. My attorney immediately looped in the state regulatory board and, given the scale of the fraud, recommended involving local law enforcement's Financial Crimes Division as well. This is no longer just an HOA dispute, she told me. This is felony-level embezzlement. And Roy just handed us the entire paper trail. Roy agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency. A decision my attorney said was both morally complicated and strategically enormous. Cornered accomplices, she explained. Either protect the person who cornered them, or they realize protecting themselves means turning on them instead. He chose himself. Debbie, unaware that her own husband had just handed investigators the keys to her downfall, continued operating as though her authority remained fully intact, scheduling another board meeting, this time proposing to formally remove Harold Kim from his position, citing insufficient loyalty to community leadership as her justification. I attended that meeting alongside my attorney, watching Debbie attempt one last consolidation of power, unaware that within days, everything she'd built would collapse far faster and far more publicly than she could possibly anticipate. There was something almost tragic in watching her fight so hard for ground already lost. I'd like to formally table any personnel decisions, my attorney announced during the meeting's public comment period, given that the state regulatory board has now opened a formal financial fraud investigation into this association, with cooperation from a board member with direct knowledge of the relevant transactions. The room fell into stunned silence. Debbie's face, for the first time since I'd met her, showed something unmistakably close to fear. "What board member?" she demanded, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer, already sensed the ground shifting fatally beneath the empire she'd spent 9 years constructing. My attorney didn't answer directly, citing ongoing investigation protocols, but the silence itself was answer enough. Debbie's eyes swept the room, landing briefly, unmistakably, on the empty chair where Roy usually sat, having quietly excused himself from attending this particular meeting for reasons that suddenly made perfect, devastating sense. "This is absurd," Debbie said, her voice climbing toward something less controlled than I'd ever heard from her. "I've done nothing but protect this community for 9 years. I won't stand here and be accused of crimes by a woman who moved in 6 months ago and decided she knew better." "Nobody's accusing you of anything tonight," my attorney said calmly. "The state investigators will make that determination based on the evidence. I'd simply advise you to consult your own legal counsel before this meeting continues any further." Debbie stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor, and left without another word. The meeting dissolved into chaos after she left. Board members talking over each other, neighbors in the audience whispering urgently, Harold Kim sitting quietly at the head of the table, looking simultaneously relieved and devastated by everything unfolding around him after 9 years of quiet, complicit silence. I drove home that night with a strange, hollow feeling instead of triumph. Winning, I was learning, rarely felt as clean as I'd once imagined it would. Somewhere in that neighborhood, a woman who'd terrorized dozens of families for nearly a decade was finally facing consequences, and it still felt heavier than victorious. That heaviness didn't last long. 2 days later, Debbie's desperation took its most dangerous turn yet, when Josephine called me late at night, voice trembling, reporting that someone had cut the brake line on her car, discovered only when her mechanic noticed fluid pooling beneath the vehicle during a routine oil change. The mechanic was certain it wasn't accidental wear. Clean, deliberate cuts, positioned exactly where they'd cause maximum danger on the steep hill leading out of Lake Serenity Estates. Josephine, 73 years old, had nearly driven that hill twice that week before the damage was discovered by pure, terrifying luck. I called Officer Delgado immediately, and within hours, the case shifted decisively from a civil HOA dispute into active criminal investigation. Security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera, positioned just close enough to Josephine's driveway, captured a figure in dark clothing near her car late the previous night. Build and gait unmistakably familiar. The footage wasn't perfectly clear. Not enough alone for an arrest. But combined with everything else, the fraud, the fabricated fines, the vandalism, the pattern of escalating retaliation against anyone who challenged her, it was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant to search Debbie's home and vehicle. Debbie wasn't home when officers arrived with the warrant, having apparently left early that morning without telling anyone, including, notably, Roy, who stood in his own driveway looking as blindsided as everyone else by his wife's sudden disappearance right as the investigation reached its most critical, dangerous turn. For nearly 2 days, Marina Court existed in a strange, suspended tension, neighbors gathering in small, worried clusters, exchanging theories, watching the empty house at the end of the cul-de-sac as though it might reveal something simply through prolonged observation. Even the lake seemed unusually still during those uncertain hours. I barely slept, replaying every interaction with Debbie, wondering how someone I'd known for 6 months had escalated from a 911 call over moving boxes to what investigators were now treating as attempted vehicular sabotage against an elderly woman. The scale of it still felt almost impossible to fully absorb. Josephine, remarkably, remained steadier than I expected, though I suspected decades of surviving quieter forms of Debbie's cruelty had built a resilience I hadn't yet needed to develop myself. "She's been building toward something like this for years," Josephine said quietly.
I think some part of her always...
Debbie was located on the 3rd day, at a motel 2 hours away, using her sister's name to check in. A detail investigators found particularly damning given how carefully, almost compulsively, she'd once policed everyone else's honesty and compliance while apparently maintaining none of it herself when the pressure finally came. She was arrested without incident, according to the report, though Officer Delgado later told me privately that she'd spent most of the ride back insisting the entire situation was a misunderstanding orchestrated by a jealous new neighbor, a narrative that would find no traction whatsoever once the actual evidence reached a courtroom. The break line charge remained under active investigation, harder to prove definitively than the financial fraud. But the embezzlement case, thanks to Roy's cooperation and my own carefully maintained documentation, moved forward swiftly, with state prosecutors describing it in local news coverage as one of the most extensive HOA fraud schemes they'd handled in years. Roy, in exchange for his cooperation, avoided the most serious charges, though he faced his own separate financial penalties and a permanent, humiliating removal from any future HOA leadership role, a consequence that felt, to everyone who'd watched him quietly enable his wife's cruelty for years, entirely appropriate rather than harsh. In the weeks that followed Debbie's arrest, the true scale of what she'd built slowly emerged through the investigation, and it became clear this had never really been about tomato plants, or mailboxes, or even the then $140,000 quietly siphoned through her husband's shell company. It had been about control, sustained for 9 years through fear, through the exhausting calculation every resident silently performed each time a small violation notice appeared. Was it worth fighting? Or was compliance simply cheaper, easier, safer than becoming her next target? Most people, understandably, chose safety. I hadn't been able to. My attorney and I spent those weeks compiling the full financial and legal picture, alongside investigators, mapping every fine, every fabricated notice, every dollar routed through RV consulting, building a case file so thorough that even Debbie's own eventual defense attorney would later privately describe it as unusually, almost surgically complete. During this period, I returned to something I'd noticed months earlier and mostly set aside: the dormant private road easement covering Marina Court and the surrounding lake access, still technically owned by a forgotten holding company, its ownership tangled in an old, unsettled estate nobody had bothered untangling in decades. I reached out to a colleague from my old finance career, someone who specialized in exactly this kind of obscure, undervalued asset, distressed real estate holdings sitting unclaimed simply because the paperwork to claim them properly was tedious enough that most people never bothered. "This is very findable," she told me. "Give me a week." A week later, she confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The holding company owning Marina Court's private road easement and lake access rights had been dissolved through non-payment of state fees years earlier, its remaining assets technically available for acquisition through a straightforward, if bureaucratic, state unclaimed property and asset recovery process. I hadn't originally set out with any intention of acquiring the road. It had simply been an interesting, half-forgotten detail from my earlier research, filed away the way I filed everything else. But sitting in my kitchen, watching the fallout of Debbie's arrest ripple through a community she'd terrorized for years, something shifted. If I acquired that easement, formally, legally, through the same asset recovery channels my old career had trained me to navigate almost instinctively, I wouldn't just own a road. I'd hold direct legal authority over private access to the lake, the marina, and every driveway connection along Marina Court itself. It wasn't about petty revenge, though I won't pretend the thought didn't cross my mind more than once during those long, documentation-heavy weeks. It was about something steadier, ensuring that whatever governance replaced Debbie's reign couldn't simply recreate the same conditions of unchecked, unaccountable power all over again. Under some new resident's name, I filed the recovery petition quietly, working with my colleague and a real estate attorney experienced in exactly this kind of obscure municipal asset reclamation. The process, while bureaucratic, moved with surprising speed once properly documented. County officials apparently relieved to finally resolve an easement question that had technically sat unaddressed for over a decade. While that process unfolded in the background, the HOA itself entered its own kind of crisis. Debbie's arrest having left a leadership vacuum nobody seemed particularly eager to fill.
Harold Kim.
Still visibly shaken by everything he'd learned, called an emergency election, insisting the community deserved actual, transparent leadership going forward. I hadn't planned on running for anything. My 6 months in Lake Serenity Estates had been consumed almost entirely by survival, documentation, and, eventually, quiet vindication. But Josephine, along with several other neighbors, approached me directly, asking whether I'd consider stepping into a board position once the election was finally held. "You're the only person who actually fought back and won," Josephine said simply. "That matters more than you probably realize, especially to people who've spent years too afraid to try." I told her I'd think about it, though some part of me had already begun quietly considering what real, accountable leadership might look like here. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Debbie progressed through its early legal stages, with prosecutors formally charging her with embezzlement, fraud, and, following further forensic analysis of the brake line, attempted assault, a charge that transformed local coverage of the story from a quirky neighborhood scandal into something considerably more serious and sobering. Local news picked up the story with predictable intensity, running segments about the HOA president who terrorized her own neighborhood, interviewing several residents, including the Ibrahim family, who'd finally returned, cautiously, to speak publicly about what had driven them from their home nearly 2 years earlier under circumstances eerily similar to my own. Watching the Ibrahims describe their experience on camera, calm but visibly still carrying the weight of it, confirmed something my documentation had already suggested. I wasn't Debbie's first target, and without the state complaint, the financial investigation, and Roy's eventual cooperation, I almost certainly wouldn't have been her last. The asset recovery petition for the road easement cleared its final procedural hurdle roughly 6 weeks after Debbie's arrest, transferring legal ownership through a newly formed holding entity I'd established with my attorney's guidance of the private road, marina access, and lake usage rights covering the entirety of Marina Court. I remember sitting at my kitchen table when the confirmation email arrived, staring at it for a long moment before fully processing what it actually meant. Every resident on this street, including whoever eventually replaced Debbie in leadership, would now require my entity's formal cooperation for any future road maintenance, lake access, or marina usage decisions. It wasn't total control over the HOA itself, and I had no interest in becoming some new version of the tyranny I'd just spent months dismantling. But it was leverage, substantial and legitimate, ensuring that whatever came next for this community couldn't simply ignore the concerns of residents the way Debbie always had. I disclosed the acquisition transparently at the next community meeting, walking Harold Kim and the interim board through exactly what it meant, what my intentions were, and, critically, what limits I intended to place on my own authority going forward, including a formal commitment to a resident advisory vote on any major access decisions. "I'm not interested in replacing one person's unchecked power with another's," I told the room, watching several faces that had grown understandably wary of anyone holding significant authority over their community relax slightly at the clarification. "I want this neighborhood to have actual accountability. Structurally, not just through good intentions." Harold, visibly moved by the transparency, proposed formally incorporating resident approval requirements into the HOA's actual bylaws for any future easement or access-related decisions, ensuring that even if I someday sold or transferred my holding entity, no future owner could wield it the way Debbie had wielded her presidency. The community, still raw from everything that had happened, approved the proposal almost unanimously, a small but meaningful act of collective healing that felt, after everything, like the first genuinely hopeful moment Marina Court had experienced in longer than most residents could clearly remember. Debbie's criminal case moved toward trial over the following months, The evidence, thanks to careful documentation from multiple residents, financial records from Roy's cooperation, and forensic analysis of both the break line and the fraudulent fine notices, forming a case her defense attorney reportedly described privately as nearly impossible to meaningfully contest. I was called to testify during pretrial proceedings. Walking the court through the timeline my spreadsheet had originally been built to simply protect myself. The fabricated fines, the illegal surveillance photographs, the pattern of selective enforcement that had targeted, almost exclusively, residents least likely or able to fight back. Sitting across the courtroom from Debbie during that testimony, I expected to feel something sharper, more triumphant. Instead, I mostly felt tired, and a quiet, settled clarity that this had never really been a personal feud, however much she'd tried to make it feel that way. It had been accountability, finally arriving. Debbie didn't testify in her own defense. On her attorney's advice, given the overwhelming weight of documented evidence against her. Roy testified instead, quiet and visibly ashamed, describing years of watching his wife's control over the neighborhood curdle slowly into something he'd been too afraid, for too long, to meaningfully challenge. I told myself I was keeping the peace, Roy said during his testimony. According to court records I later reviewed. I think I was just keeping myself safe. There's a difference. And I understand that now, even if I understood it about 9 years too late to matter for the people we hurt. The prosecution's closing argument leaned heavily on the pattern itself. The way Debbie's cruelty had never been random but calculated. Targeting new residents, older residents, and immigrant families disproportionately, people statistically less likely to have the resources, standing, or confidence to challenge an HOA president's authority directly and effectively. I thought about Josephine during that closing argument. 73 years old, decades in this community, silenced for years simply because standing alone against. Someone like Debbie had never felt survivable, until suddenly, with documentation, legal support, and a coalition of equally exhausted neighbors, finally did. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on the embezzlement and fraud charges, though the attempted assault charge related to the break line ultimately resulted in a hung jury. The forensic evidence compelling but not, in the end, entirely conclusive enough for unanimous certainty. Debbie was sentenced to 4 years for the financial crimes, with restitution ordered covering the full amount embezzled from the HOA, plus damages awarded to several residents, including Josephine, whose legal fees and fabricated fine payments were formally repaid in full as part of the court's final restitution order. On the day of sentencing, I sat in the courtroom beside Josephine, watching Debbie Voss, once the most feared woman on Marina Court, led out in handcuffs, her composure finally, completely gone, replaced by something small and defeated that looked almost nothing like the woman who'd once called 911 on my moving truck. I didn't feel joy watching that moment. Exactly. I felt something closer to relief, the specific, bone-deep relief of watching a threat that had shadowed an entire community finally, formally, legally neutralized, ensuring whatever came next for Marina Court could be built on something sturdier than fear. Roy received a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Community service and probation rather than prison time. A resolution some residents found frustratingly lenient, and others, myself included, understood as the practical cost of the cooperation that had made Debbie's full conviction possible in the first place. He moved out of Lake Serenity Estates within weeks of the sentencing, selling the house at the end of the cul-de-sac quietly, without fanfare, without the the Voss residence sign that had once announced his and Debbie's presence so confidently at the top of the street. The house sat empty for a while after that, a strange, quiet monument to everything that had happened, until Harold Kim, now formally elected HOA president in a landslide following the emergency election, proposed converting it into a small community center, funded partly through recovered restitution funds and partly through voluntary resident contributions. I contributed to that fund, along with nearly every household on Marina Court, a small, collective act of reclaiming something from the wreckage Debbie had left behind, turning the house that had once symbolized her unchecked authority into something genuinely, structurally shared among everyone who'd survived her 9-year reign. Josephine, in a moment that felt like the story's quiet, fitting conclusion, was asked to cut the ribbon at the community center's opening. 6 months after Debbie's sentencing, standing on the same lawn where she'd once warned me, cautiously, to watch myself around the woman who'd terrorized this street for years. "I never thought I'd see this day," she told the small crowd gathered for the opening, her voice steady in a way I hadn't heard when we first met. "For a long time, I thought silence was the only way to survive here. I'm glad someone finally proved that wrong." I stood near the back of that small crowd, biscuits leash in hand, watching neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid conflict now laughing together over lemonade on a lawn that finally, genuinely, belonged to all of them rather than to whoever shouted loudest or held the most fear over everyone else. The road easement I'd acquired remained in place, formally governed now by the resident advisory structure Harold had helped establish. Quiet, permanent safeguard against any future leader tempted to rule Marina Court the way Debbie once had, through fear,
Fabrication.
and the exhausting calculation of who could afford to fight back. I never set out to become the person who owned the street, or the person who helped take down a corrupt HOA president, or the reluctant face of a small, hard-won community reckoning. I'd simply wanted a quiet house on a lake, and instead I'd found a fight I hadn't chosen but refused to lose. Looking back, I understand now that the 911 call on my very first day wasn't really about a moving truck, or a woman Debbie didn't recognize, or even suspicion at all. It was about control, tested immediately, reflexively, on someone Debbie assumed would fold the way so many others quietly had before me. I didn't fold. I stayed patient, methodical, and quiet in exactly the way my old career had trained me to be, letting the pattern of her own choices eventually build the case that no amount of authority, charm, or fear could ultimately protect her from once it was finally, fully exposed. Some evenings now, I sit on my back porch, the same porch where I once watched my first sunset in this house, convinced the earlier police call had simply been a misunderstanding, and I watch the lake instead, calm, undisturbed, exactly the peace I'd originally come here looking for. Biscuit still barks at squirrels most mornings, though there's no one left on the street timing it with a stopwatch. No fabricated citation waiting under my windshield wiper. No slideshow of zoomed photographs prepared for some emergency meeting designed to publicly humiliate whoever Debbie, had decided to target that particular month. Josephine and I have coffee together most weekends now, on whichever porch feels right that day. The fear that once defined her relationship to this neighborhood replaced by something steadier, something closer to the genuine community Lake Serenity Estates, had always advertised in its glossy listing photos but never actually provided until now. The Ibrahims, I heard recently through Harold, are considering moving back, drawn by news of the leadership change, the community center, and the quiet, structural safeguards now built into the very bylaws that once fabricated fines against them without a shred of legitimate justification behind any of it. I still think sometimes about that first morning, the moving truck, the paint-stained shirt, the police cruiser turning slowly onto Marina Court while I stood frozen on my own front steps, wondering what I'd done wrong. I know now I hadn't done anything wrong at all. I'd simply arrived somewhere that needed changing. Debbie remains in prison. For years. Restitution ordered. Her name still occasionally surfacing in conversations among residents who lived through her reign, though less often now, replaced increasingly by conversations about lake maintenance schedules, community center events, and the small, unremarkable business of an actually functioning, actually fair neighborhood. I think about power differently now than I did before moving here, about how easily it accumulates in the hands of people confident enough to claim it and unopposed long enough to believe it's permanent, and about how quickly, once genuinely challenged with patience and proof, that same power can collapse entirely. I didn't set out to own this street. I set out to survive one woman's cruelty with my dignity, my finances, and my home intact. That the fight ended with me holding formal legal authority over the very road she once tried to exile me from still strikes me, most days, as almost too neat to be real. But it is real. Documented in county records, court transcripts, and a community center standing where fear once lived. And every morning I wake up to that same quiet, like I first fell in love with. I'm reminded that sometimes the best response to someone determined to make you small is simply to stay, and to document everything. Harold still serves as HOA president. Transparent, accountable, quick to remind the board whenever proposed rules start drifting toward the kind of vague, easily weaponized language Debbie once used so effectively against anyone she decided didn't belong. The bylaws are public now, genuinely public, posted online for any resident to review freely. The tomato plants, incidentally, remain in my garden, thriving, entirely unremarked upon by anyone, since the approved plant list Debbie once cited turned out, upon full bylaw review, to have never actually existed anywhere except in the 17-page welcome packet she'd printed on her own personal letterhead 9 years earlier. Sometimes new residents move onto Marina Court, and Josephine, without fail, walks over with a genuine welcome basket, homemade bread, real information about the actual bylaws, and a story, gentle but clear, about a woman who once ruled the street through fear, and about how thoroughly, permanently, that era finally ended. I've been asked more than once whether I regret how aggressively I documented and pursued everything, whether a quieter, more conciliatory approach might have spared everyone the courtroom, the headlines, the messy unraveling of an entire family. I don't regret it. Exactly what had protected Debbie for 9 years. What finally stopped her wasn't anger or confrontation. or even, honestly, courage in the dramatic sense people sometimes imagine. It was patience, documentation, and a refusal to let fabricated authority go unquestioned simply because questioning it felt exhausting, inconvenient, or socially risky in a neighborhood that had learned to fear disruption more than injustice. Marina Court looks almost exactly the same as it did the day I moved in. The same lake, the same willow trees, the same modest, comfortable houses along a quiet cul-de-sac. What changed wasn't the scenery. What changed was who held power here, and, more importantly, how thoroughly that power now answers to everyone. I still keep the original spreadsheet, the one that started with a single $50 mailbox fine and grew, over months, into the backbone of a criminal fraud case. I never deleted it. Not out of anger anymore, but as a quiet reminder of exactly how much patience eventually accomplishes. Biscuit's dog Run still sits along the side yard. The red spray-painted X long since power washed away, though I sometimes catch myself glancing at that spot on the fence, remembering how frightening, disorienting, and lonely that particular escalation once felt, back when I still believed I might be facing this alone. I wasn't alone. In the end, though it took months to fully understand that. Josephine, Harold, even Roy in his own complicated, guilt-driven way, all became part of dismantling something none of us had chosen but all of us, eventually, refused to keep quietly enduring once a real path forward finally appeared. The lake still reflects the morning light exactly the way it did in those original listing photos that first drew me to this house. Promising peace I genuinely wasn't sure, for a long stretch of that first difficult year, I'd ever actually get to experience here the way I'd originally imagined. I have it now, though, genuinely, structurally, in a way that feels earned rather than simply lucky. Not because I own the road beneath everyone's driveways, though I do, but because the fear that once defined this street has been replaced by something sturdier. Accountability, transparency, and a community finally allowed to trust its own leadership. Debbie Voss spent 9 years convinced that Marina Court belonged to her, that her authority was permanent, unquestionable, and immune to consequence, right up until a woman she dismissed as an unfamiliar stranger in paint-stained clothes turned out to be exactly the kind of person patient, thorough, and unafraid enough to prove her wrong. I think about that irony often, how the very qualities Debbie mistook for weakness that first morning, my calm, my quiet compliance with the police, my refusal to escalate loudly in the moment, were the same qualities that eventually built an airtight case strong enough to end her reign permanently and completely. People sometimes ask what I'd tell someone facing a similar situation. A neighbor, an HOA, any small authority abusing power over people too exhausted or afraid to challenge it directly. My answer is always the same. Stay calm. Document everything, and never assume the people enabling that power are as loyal as they appear. Roy's cooperation, born entirely out of guilt and exhaustion rather than any grand moral awakening, ended up being one of the most decisive factors in the entire case. A reminder that even the quietest enablers of cruelty sometimes carry more doubt and more potential usefulness than anyone watching from outside might initially assume. The community center bustles most weekends now. Book clubs, potlucks, a small farmers market Josephine organized entirely on her own initiative, Activities that would have been unthinkable during Debbie's reign, when gathering too visibly, too happily, risked drawing her attention and, inevitably, some newly invented violation notice. I've come to genuinely love this house, this street, this small, imperfect, healing community, in a way I couldn't have fully imagined during those first exhausting months of citations, slideshows, and fabricated fines. The piece I originally paid cash for finally actually exists here now, earned rather than simply promised. Occasionally I still receive calls from other neighborhoods, other HOAs, residents who've heard some version of my story through local news coverage or word of mouth, asking for advice on documenting their own suspicious fine patterns, their own overreaching board presidents, their own quiet, exhausting versions of what Marina Court once endured. I always tell them the same thing Josephine once told me, though I understand its weight far more deeply now than I did the first time I heard it. Watch yourself, document everything, and remember that people who rule through fear are rarely as powerful, or as untouchable, as they've worked so hard to appear. The trial transcripts remain part of the public record now. A small, permanent testament to everything Debbie built and everything it eventually cost her. The money, the marriage, essentially, since Roy filed for divorce quietly during her sentencing. And, most significantly, the absolute authority she'd spent 9 years convincing herself was untouchable. I sold nothing, moved nowhere, changed almost nothing about the quiet life I'd originally hoped to build here, except that now, finally, that quiet life actually belongs to me, and to everyone else on this street, without the constant, exhausting undercurrent of fear that once defined Marina Court before I ever arrived. Harold recently proposed renaming the community center's main gathering room after Josephine, a small, well-deserved honor for a woman who'd endured Debbie's cruelty longest and spoken up soonest once a real opportunity finally appeared. The vote passed unanimously, the fastest, most joyful board decision in the community's entire recorded history. I attended that vote from the back row, the way I'd once sat quietly through my very first HOA meeting, notebook in hand, hoping simply to blend in and avoid conflict. I don't sit quietly in the back anymore. I speak up now, calmly, deliberately, exactly the way this entire ordeal eventually taught me to. The lake outside my window still catches the morning light the same way it did that very first sunset. Back when I told myself the 911 call was simply an isolated misunderstanding I'd never have to think about again. I was wrong about it being isolated. I was right that it wouldn't define me. What defines Marina Court now is something Debbie Voss never once managed to build in 9 years of unchecked authority. Genuine trust, structurally protected, transparently governed, and finally, permanently, no longer dependent on any single person's willingness to be cruel, or any single resident's exhausted willingness to simply comply and stay quiet. I still keep Officer Delgado's card in my kitchen drawer, though I haven't needed it in over a year now. Sometimes he waves from his cruiser when patrolling the neighborhood, a small, ordinary gesture that somehow still carries the weight of everything that first difficult morning eventually led toward. Josephine's ribbon-cutting photograph hangs in the new community center's entryway now, right beside a small plaque listing every household who contributed to its funding. Quiet, permanent record of a neighborhood that chose, eventually, collectively, To rebuild something honest out of everything Debbie's cruelty had originally tried to tear apart. The financial restitution, once finalized, restored every fabricated fine, every improperly assessed fee, every dollar Debbie and Roy had diverted through years of quiet, calculated fraud, back to the residents who'd paid them, often out of fear rather than any genuine violation, for far longer than any of us had realized. Josephine used part of her restitution to finally repave her own driveway, a small, ordinary home improvement that felt, given everything, like a quiet, personal declaration that fear no longer dictated how she spent her own money, or her own peace of mind, on her own property. I used part of mine to expand my garden. Tomatoes included, of course, a small, deliberate act of reclaiming exactly the kind of ordinary domestic joy Debbie had once tried so hard, so absurdly, to police and restrict on a technicality that had never actually existed in any legitimate bylaw. The road easement remains under the resident advisory structure Harold established, reviewed annually by a rotating committee of volunteers, none of whom, notably, have ever attempted to use that authority the way Debbie once used hers, perhaps because the entire community remains acutely, permanently aware of exactly where that road once led. I think Debbie genuinely believed, right up until the handcuffs, that her authority was simply too established, too deeply woven into the neighborhood's daily operations, to ever meaningfully be challenged. She mistook 9 years of silence for 9 years of genuine support, a miscalculation that eventually cost her everything she'd built. That miscalculation, I've come to understand, is common among people who rule through fear rather than trust. Silence looks identical to loyalty from the outside, right up until someone finally proves, decisively, that it was never loyalty at all, just exhaustion, patiently waiting for a safe enough moment to finally speak. Marina Court gave dozens of people that safe moment. Eventually, though it took one stubborn newcomer, a folder full of documentation, a nervous husband's guilty conscience, and a genuinely patient legal process to finally provide it after 9 years of quiet, accumulating grievances nobody had previously felt safe enough to voice collectively. I don't think of myself as any kind of hero in this story, despite how neatly it might read that way in hindsight. I think of myself as someone who simply refused to fold under pressure that was never legitimate in the first place, and who happened to have the professional training to prove it. Not everyone facing something like this has that same training, that same access to legal resources, that same financial cushion allowing months of documentation and legal fees without genuine hardship. I think about that often, about how many other Marina courts exist quietly, unresolved, simply because their version of me never arrived. It's part of why I still take those calls, from strangers in other neighborhoods, offering whatever guidance, whatever documentation strategies, whatever quiet encouragement might help someone else recognize the same pattern I eventually recognized here, before it costs them nearly as much as it nearly cost Josephine's life on that steep hill. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac, once home to the Voss residence sign and 9 years of unchecked authority, now hosts weekly potlucks, a small lending library Josephine curates herself, and, most Saturdays, exactly the kind of ordinary, unremarkable community joy this neighborhood's original listing photos had always promised but never actually delivered. I sit on my porch most evenings now, Biscuit curled up beside me, watching the same lake that first drew me here. Finally, genuinely at peace in a way that first difficult year made me wonder if I'd ever actually get to experience within these particular gates. On this particular street, Debbie Voss remains, as far as I know, still serving her sentence. Her name occasionally surfacing in conversations that grow rarer and quieter with each passing season, replaced increasingly by conversations about lake cleanup days, community center events, and the small, unremarkable, hard-won business of an actually fair, actually accountable neighborhood. I never expected, moving in that first chaotic morning with a moving truck and a scruffy terrier, that I'd end up not just surviving a corrupt HOA president's reign, but helping dismantle it entirely and holding, almost accidentally, formal legal authority over the very street she once tried so hard to exile me from. But that's exactly what happened. Documented thoroughly enough now that it exists as public record, as court transcript, as community center plaque, as a quiet, permanent reminder to anyone who ever considers ruling Marina Court through fear again. Someone here will document everything, and eventually, that documentation will matter. Josephine still tells the story sometimes. To new residents, to visiting family, to anyone who asks about the community center's slightly unusual name plaque or the small, framed newspaper clipping hanging quietly near the entrance. She tells it calmly now, without the fear that once colored every mention of Debbie's name. We had a woman here once, she says, who thought this street belonged to her alone. Didn't. It just took the right person, at the right time, refusing to believe that, to finally prove it belonged to all of us instead. I still get a little emotional hearing it. The lake outside remains exactly as beautiful as those original listing photos promised. Willow trees swaying, water catching the morning light, the specific, hard-won piece I'd originally paid cash for finally, genuinely mine, not because of any road easement or legal authority, but because fear no longer defines what this street means to me. Harold recently mentioned, almost in passing, that Lake Serenity Estate's property values have actually risen faster than neighboring communities since the scandal. Ironically, driven largely by the transparent, accountable governance structure that emerged directly from everything Debbie's cruelty and eventual downfall forced this community to finally, thoroughly rebuild from scratch. I think about that irony sometimes, how the very thing Debbie always claimed to be protecting, property values, community reputation, neighborhood pride, ended up genuinely thriving. Only after her particular, fear-based version of protecting it was permanently, legally, and thoroughly dismantled by the very documentation she once mistook for harmless paperwork. Roy, I heard through Harold recently, moved several states away after finalizing his divorce, working quietly in some unrelated field, largely avoiding any further contact with the community he'd once helped, however reluctantly, terrorize alongside his wife for years before finally choosing, at considerable personal cost, to help end it instead. I don't know if Debbie has ever fully reckoned with what she did, or whether she still, somewhere, believes the entire ordeal was simply an injustice inflicted upon her by an ungrateful, disloyal community she'd spent 9 years genuinely believing she was protecting rather than terrorizing. I suspect I'll never actually know. What I do know is that Marina Court healed, Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, in the months and years following her arrest, rebuilding itself into exactly the kind of community its original glossy listing photos had always promised. Quiet, connected, and finally, structurally, safe from any single person's unchecked authority ever again. Josephine and I still have coffee most weekends, watching the lake, watching new residents settle in without the fear that once shadowed every single new arrival on this street. Watching biscuit chase squirrels across lawns nobody photographs with a zoom lens anymore. Watching a neighborhood, finally, simply be a neighborhood. The road easement paperwork sits quietly in a folder in my home office now, alongside the original spreadsheet, the court transcripts, and every fabricated fine notice I once collected out of simple, stubborn self-preservation. Keep it all, not out of lingering anger, but as a quiet record of exactly what patience accomplished here. I think about that first morning often. The police cruiser, the paint-stained shirt, the confusion and fear of explaining my own existence in my own driveway. I understand now that morning wasn't really the beginning of a neighborhood dispute. It was the beginning of a reckoning 9 years overdue, and I simply happened to arrive right on time. Marina Court belongs to everyone now, structurally, legally, and, more importantly, genuinely, in a way it never quite managed to during Debbie Voss's 9-year reign of fabricated fines, fear, and quietly accumulating cruelty. It took one stubborn newcomer, a folder of documentation, and a community finally ready to speak up together. I still own the road beneath everyone's driveways here. Technically, legally, formally, but I've never once used that authority the way Debbie used hers. I don't think I ever will. Some kinds of power, once you've watched what they cost, are worth holding only carefully, transparently, and always accountably. The lake still catches the morning light exactly the way it did that very first sunset. Back when I told myself the 911 call was simply an isolated misunderstanding. I understand now it wasn't isolated at all. It was the opening move in a fight I never chose, but ultimately, thoroughly, won. I sit here most evenings now, biscuit at my feet, the water calm and golden in the fading light. Genuinely, finally at peace on the street I once feared I might have to fight to simply belong on. Marina Court is quiet now. Not the fearful kind of quiet. The real kind. Debbie Voss is gone from this street, from this lake, from the authority she once wielded like a birthright, and in her place stands something she never once managed to build in 9 years of ruling through fear. A genuine, accountable, thriving community, finally, permanently, safely home. The END.